What's up, gang? Welcome to the Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mirshahzadeh. I'm so pumped to have you here with me. Now listen, the Greatness Machine, we're about two things. Number one, people who are living their passions. And number two, those who are creating greatness in the world and doing both of these things despite the odds against them. Each episode, we're going to feature interviews with game changers, business leaders, telling us their origin stories, what made them tick, what got them to where they are now. Why? So it can help you step into your greatness within your life, your business, and your career. Occasionally, you might hear a few solo episodes from myself, more as I leverage my 20 years of entrepreneurship as a CEO and founder to help you grow and level up in your journey to scale your life and your business. So come be a fly on the wall, enjoy the conversation, and I'm stoked to have you here with me. Guys, welcome to today's episode of The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mirshahzadeh, and boy, do we have a special guest. My man, Morgan Housel is in the house. What's up, man?
Good to see you, Darius. Thanks for having me.
Oh man, I've been so pumped. The minute I saw you booked for the show, I was like doing cartwheels, even though I'm not good at them. And it was one of those moments, man. So I'm so pumped to have you here to talk about all the cool things you're doing.
Hopefully you didn't throw your back out, but I appreciate it.
I've been doing a lot of like Romanian deadlifts, so I'm doing pretty well there. But yeah,
good.
No, it was good. Do you mind if I do a little bit of a housekeeping and we'll get started?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Guys, for listeners who are new to the show, The Greatness Machine, we're about two things. People are living their passions and those creating greatness in the world and doing so despite the odds. And my man Morgan here is neither short of passion nor greatness. So I'm going to give some background here. Morgan doesn't know this, but I'm kind of a bookworm. I'm on my, so last year I started reading pretty aggressively and I think I did 35 books last year. One of the books, of which I'm going to show on the video, was his book, The Psychology of Money. One of the themes for me last year was money. So I was reading a lot of books on money. I read Happy Money. I read The Psychology of Money. And I loved the book. I was like, man, I was referring your book to a ton of people in the different worlds I run in. And so this year I'm like, all right, man, I hit 35 books last year. What am I gonna do this year? So I said, I'll do 40. And then I was like, no, fuck that. I'm doing 52. I'm doing 52 books in 52 weeks. So I'm on my 52nd book right now. I'm finishing the new Elon Musk book, which have you read that book?
No, it's on my list, but
man,
definitely familiar with it.
He is a crazy he is a crazy ass dude. I thought, everyone knows he's a little bit weird, but I have actually met him in real life and I thought he was weird then. And now I think he's way weirder after reading the book, but great book. Highly recommend it. But your book, another one of the books made the list this year. And so I'm really stoked to have you here today to talk about your new book, Same as Ever. So we're gonna be talking about that. First of all, congratulations on the book, man. It's an awesome book. I loved reading it.
Thank you.
And so, I'm going to tell you this right now. I'm going to pump your ego up a little bit. So there's certain books like authors that, that are out there. I would say like Ryan Holiday is one of the ones on my list. You're now one of the ones on my list where like when you put out a book, I'm like, oh, I got to go read his new book because this guy just freaking crushes when he writes books. So yeah, man, really pumped to talk about the book. Before we do talk about the new book, do you mind if I do a little bit of giving your formal bio for listeners who may be not familiar with your work and we get a little bit of your background? Is that cool?
Yep, let's do it.
So you guys, for those of you that are familiar with Morgan, he goes, I don't need to give too much of an introduction, but for our listeners who maybe are not familiar with Morgan, you got to like crawl out from under the rock and go pay attention to the world out there because this man's doing some cool stuff. So as I mentioned before, author of Psychology of Money. We're going to be talking about his new book, Same as Ever, a guide to what never changes, which I absolutely loved. He's the host of the Morgan Housel podcast, very popular podcast, partner at the Collaborative Fund, two-time winner of the Best in Business Awards from the Society of American Business Editors and Writers. He also serves on the board of directors at Markel. So if you don't mind, like here at the Greatness Machine, we love origin stories. I mean, most people don't just wake up and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna go write a bunch of badass books and like crush it in business. Morgan obviously it got there how he got there, but would love to hear some of your origin story if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, in my teenage and early college years. I wanted to be an investment banker or a hedge fund manager. And kind of in the era, the early and mid 2000s, every young, ambitious man wanted to do that. It's very different now, but back then there were at least in my circles, there was nothing more appealing than becoming an investment banker at Goldman Sachs. Like that to me was the pinnacle of life. And so I went all throughout college wanting to do that. I graduated college in 2008, which was a terrible time to graduate because the world was on fire. The economy was broken and melting down and nobody in finance was hiring. every bank, every hedge fund, everyone was laying people off, let alone like nobody's hiring. And so out of desperation is what it was. I got a job as a writer about stocks at the Motley Fool. And never in my life did I aspire to be a writer. Did I admire writers? Did I think it would be a fun job? I did it because I needed a paycheck, full stop. And they were the only people who were hiring. And I think for the first year, it felt like a job. Like I was always very interested in finance. So like, lucky me that I get to write about stocks now during this period of upheaval where there's so much to write about. So that was cool. But I never wanted to be a writer. Definitely didn't think of myself as a journalist and still don't. But I think after about a year, I really started to enjoy it. Like I love the process of analyzing what's going on in the world, trying to make sense of it, learning something, and then trying to tell a story about it for other people to learn about. That like it became a really interesting thing. I also thought it was great that I was not in the trenches, so to speak. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not a fund manager. I'm not an economist. I'm not a journalist. I'm just a guy who for the last 18 years or so has tried to make sense of the financial world, tried to learn something, and then tried to write a story about it. That's always what it's been. And so over the years, I just really fell in love with the process of writing, with the process of storytelling, trying to be succinct in the writing. It was never part of the plan. It was just a serendipitous kind of stumbled into this job and ended up falling in love with it.
It's so funny. I feel like that's probably most people's stories. They just end up in like becoming an insurance broker instead. So that they're like
I got lucky. Yeah.
Yeah. I just stumbled into like writing awesome books. Like, no, I stumbled into like, like working as an admin at a construction company.
Fair enough. But I do think to me, it always contrasts with like everyone else in college was like, I'm going to be an X and this is my path to get there. Totally. And by the time you're 40 and looking back, you're like, maybe 1 out of 50 of those people actually followed that path. The rest stumbled haphazardly into whatever they're doing.
It's so true. Like when kids are like, I was actually getting a ride home from an Uber driver 2 nights ago. I was in Southern California for Thanksgiving. I live in Austin, Texas now. And she's telling me about her 17-year-old daughter and how she's, going to, she wants to go to Cambridge and then she's going to join the FBI. This is mom telling me all this shit. And I'm like, none of that's going to happen. No, I was right. I'm like, I was humoring her. I'm like, really? I'm like, what part of the FBI she want to join? Oh, she's not sure. Maybe she might do CIA instead. And I'm like planning people when kids plan their lives in their 20s. I'm like, dude, listen, are you a fan of Naval Ravikant at all?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Actually, yeah. I think you quoted him in your book a little bit. So I'm a huge Naval fan, and he has some really interesting insights on this. He's like, look, like what industry you choose, where you live, what city you choose to live in, and like who you decide to date are like the 3 things that have the biggest determination of like how successful you'll be, right? So proximity is a big deal. What was it about proximity for you and writing? Were you always a writer? Was this something
No, I was never a writer. I mean, I have back to the origin story. My teenage years were really crazy too. I effectively did not go to high school. I was a competitive ski racer in Lake Tahoe, California, and I and the rest of my peers did an independent study program that was an utter joke. It allowed us to ski 6 days a week. And when I was 16, after doing nothing, they gave us a piece of paper that said diploma at the top of it, but we did nothing for it. We did absolutely nothing. So then I started college when I was 20 and I effectively had an 8th grade education. And I needed to make up all of that ground. I started in the most remedial courses at community college to make up for it. And so, but anyways, that's a long way of saying like, no, I was never a writer. I could write my name and a few other things when I started as a professional writer. I was an economics major in college, which was not a writing centric major either. It's a very math-based. So I had 0 writing background when I started as a professional writer. And it was really hard at first. I had to make up for a lot of lost time, so to speak.
Yeah, that's crazy. So did you grow up in Tahoe?
Yes, I grew up in Truckee.
Truckee. Okay. And where'd you go? Is it Sierra College up there? Is that there?
I went to Sierra College in Truckee, and then I went to University of Nevada, Reno for about a year. And then I transferred to USC in Southern California, which is where I got my degree.
That's so kids who are listening out there. I doubt if maybe your parents were saying you're going to go to Cambridge and join the FBI, but doesn't sound like it, right? Like that's a pretty circuitous. Maybe I'm not great with words, but like path to getting to the Motley Fool. So you ended up transferring from University of Nevada, Reno. And is your folks, are they still up in the Reno area?
They live in Northern California near Mendocino. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay. I lived in San Francisco for 17 years. I got a lot of friends in the Truckee and Reno area.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, I digress. And so so when you transfer, why did you choose SC? Were you like, as like great program and they have a good business school?
No, you want to talk about serendipity, stumbling haphazard. I had a bad breakup in Truckee, as everyone does when they're age 20. And I thought my life was over, as everyone does when they break up. And because I needed to just get out of town and start fresh, I had a friend living in Orange County. And he was like, come on down here. I thought I would move there for 6 months and come back, but I ended up staying. And then once you're in Southern California, you're just exposed to the USC cult that exists in Southern California. So when it was like, okay, now I need to go to a good school now, I applied to Pepperdine and USC, and that was it. And then so that was how I ended up there. It was a total accident mistake in itself.
That's so funny. My mom did her she's a grad, same story. She like moved from Pennsylvania to SoCal and was like going to Cal State Fullerton and ends up getting her graduate degree at SC. So I'm a Trojan family.
Love it.
So when you decided to get in right, like again, 08 was a brutal year to graduate college. You finished college. It looked like you were writing though before that for the Motley Fool. Did you start writing in college, like, or was it a after college thing? Like, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, they hired me full time when I was in my senior year, and because it's a contract work, you can do it anywhere. You can do it remotely, and it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's just turn in your articles when you're done with them. So I started full time just in my last semester of my senior year. Yeah.
And so having like dove in, did you find that I have a talent for writing, or I really liked like being kind of a commentator on what's happening? What part of writing and finance like really went hand in hand for you? What was it that like really sparked it? Was it the interest in finance and just the talent for writing? Like, what was it, the chicken or the egg on that?
I think I had been interested in finance for a long time. And I would say beyond interest, I was obsessed with it. And particularly like the value investing Warren Buffett crowd. My wife always says when we met, when we were, 20, I had Warren Buffett's annual shareholder letters on my nightstand kind of thing, which I feel like not many 20-year-olds would. So like that was always in my blood. The investing side, like I had no fears that I didn't have the material or the knowledge back then. Not to say that I knew everything. I was wrong about a lot, but I had the confidence that I can talk about investing to a public crowd. The writing aspect of it was completely new to me and terrifying, utterly terrifying to me, particularly for online writing at a platform where a lot of people are going to read this. Tens, hundreds of thousands of people are going to read every post. And in online writing, particularly back in the days of the comment section, if it's not good, people will tell you in no uncertain terms how dumb and bad and terrible you are. And they did. And that hurt, man. It was tough to be 22, have no idea what I'm doing, stumbled into this job that I don't deserve. And now 10,000 people are calling me terrible names online because of it. Like, that was hard. And look, you have to grow a thick skin as if you're putting out content online, because people are going to say terrible things. You just have to deal with it. But at first, it was really tough. And that, I think, if there's anything that almost made me quit, it was probably that. It was early on, like, but also when I look back in hindsight, when people give you that stark of feedback, you improve very quickly too. Because if you write something and people are like, "You're wrong," and you're a bad writer, then naturally you're going to be like, okay, well, how can I learn from that and try to get better? And the feedback cycle is so stark and so fast that even if you do that for 6 months, you're going to get way better, way better super quickly. Even if it's painful, it's the best way to learn.
And so you're writing for, and I love that feedback cycle is definitely like, oh, I wrote something amazing, and you just get like hammered on it, and you're like, oh, maybe it wasn't amazing. So I think that's important in all like businesses or jobs, is like, how can I get that open-minded feedback loop so I can like, harden up quickly, even in sports, right? Like getting that feedback loop in sports, like you're a competitive ski racer, the mountain gives you feedback real quickly, right?
It'll throw you on your ass if you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So it's funny, like we live in a society now where people don't always get that feedback, or they don't want that harsh feedback. I do think that there's a delivery of it that helps, right? So to your point with the mountain doesn't care, it just crushes you, and you get that feedback. So for you, when did you have that moment where you're like, all right, man, I think I can do this? Like, you're getting a lot of feedback, some of it good, some of it bad. But when was the moment where you're like, yeah, this is how I want to spend my time?
I think within 6 months, I had some sense of, oh, I'm actually not bad at this. I don't know if I'm good at it, but I'm not bad at it. And then it was probably, but my assumption when I started was I'm going to be really bad at this. That was
Wow.
my assumption. And so even just not sucking was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. But it was probably not until I'd been doing it for a couple years, 4 years, maybe even 5 years before it was like, not only do I enjoy this, but I think I'm pretty good at it. And this is all I want to do. I can't imagine doing anything else. But that probably took 5 years of doing it. I think the chip on my shoulder of I wanted to be a hedge fund manager and now I'm a blogger. Like that chip on my
Oh,
shoulder took a long time to brush off. Now it's fully brushed off. And now the idea of being a hedge fund manager was be utterly repulsive to me. So
interesting.
it took a long time, but it was never, and also I would say there was no like aha moment. It was a very slow realization that this is what I wanted to do. And honestly, when I wrote my first book, which came out in 2020, so at that point I had been a professional writer for 13 years. And I think that if there was any aha moment that like, I'm a writer, this is what I'm going to do, it was then. It took 13 years to get there.
Yeah, well, there's have you ever heard, Adrian Brody, the Academy Award winner?
Yeah.
His dad, when he won his Academy Award, his dad said it took 13 years to become an overnight success, right?
Right.
So
It's always the case for anyone who you look up to, even if it seems like they have quick success. It's like behind the scenes is decades of torture and pain to get there.
totally, it's that iceberg like poster people have in their office where it like shows the tip of the iceberg and then you see it goes down like 2 miles under the ocean. It's like
It's always
that's what you
is.
don't see. That's the
Always.
like getting crushed when you're in '07, like not being able to get a job out of college, like sucking. Like no one sees that. They just see like, oh, he wrote this great book and he's popular now. Like oh, that's
Totally.
great. I love
Yep.
that. Well, let's talk about the new book, man. Like first of all, I love the book. It's just like it was such an interesting approach. So the new book is Same as Ever, A Guide to What Never Changes. So first of all, I was like, this is a really interesting perspective, which is we hear about the world's changing faster and faster around us, and there's always so much change. And you kind of went inside out on this and said, hey, I'm going to talk about the things that never change. And
Yeah.
I was like, that's a really interesting process, like thing to think about. To walk us through like what the book, why did you decide to write it? I'd love to hear a little bit of the backstory there.
Well, thanks. It's always been interesting to me as like a student and fan of history that when you're reading history about something that happened 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, you're automatically going to notice the things that are different, how life has changed, how technology has changed. But to me, the most interesting thing is reading about what people used to do a long time ago in the past and being like, we do the same thing today. You change the dates on this from 1823 to 2023, and all of these words would have fit right in. Those are the moments of reading history where you're like, that's really important. If you find something that has not changed in hundreds of years, you found something that is extremely important because you know it's going to be part of your future. If it hasn't changed in 1,000 years, it's not going to change over the next 1,000 years. And so you can't say that about politics. You can't say it about technology. You can't say it about different industries. You can say it about all kinds of different human behaviors that have never changed. How people respond to greed and fear and risk and opportunity, tribalism. These things have not changed in 1,000 years or more. And so that's going to be part of your future. A lot of this too was my kind of frustration in the financial industry over how bad we are at predicting the next recession, the next bear market, whatever it might be. Nobody can do it. There's no track record of people doing it. And so for me, it was, okay, stop trying to focus on what you think is going to change because we can't do it. Stop pretending that you can. And instead, let's focus all of our energy on what we know is not going to change. That's going to give us a much clearer view of what the future will be for us. And so looking back at a lot of what I wrote and was interested in, like those are the dots that I connected, is I was always interested in behaviors that never changed. And once you come up with enough of these little anecdotes and stories and examples, it was like, this is the book that I want to write and need to write.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and like I'm kind of a numbers geek, and so as I started like diving into the book, there was just some data points. So I'm like, huh, like who would have thought of that? And like one of the coolest data points I loved in the book was talking about like how the impossible happens millions of times, right? That like a 1 in a billion chance happens millions of times because you have 100 billion humans have lived and 1.2 billion days that they've lived, or 1.2 million, was it 1.2 million billion days that they've lived? So you start looking at stuff like that and you're like, Oh wow, like he's right. Kind of like everything has happened or can happen, and I love really the perspective around certainty and what people really want. So there was some really cool concepts in there. I'd love it if you wouldn't mind, and I know that obviously, if you don't mind, like kind of break down how you structured the book, because I thought the structure of the book was unique and interesting, and I think it's something that really kept my attention, which I think says a lot, and b was a really interesting way to kind of break down this idea of teaching people like what doesn't change.
Yeah, I mean, the book is structured as 23 very short stories. By very short, it's, the average book chapter in an average nonfiction book is probably 5 to 7,000 words. The average chapter in my books is 2,000, so much shorter. A lot of that was everybody knows, particularly in nonfiction, that most nonfiction books are too long. They could have been a long magazine article that explained their topic, but instead they're just extended out to 250 pages, rambling on the same topic. To me, the only way to combat that is basically a book of essays, all of which could live independently. You can start this book on chapter 18 if you want. You can jump right in because every chapter lives on its own. And also, my writing style has always been what's your point? Get to the point and get out of the reader's way, out of respect for the reader. Because, the average nonfiction book is 70,000 words. You do not need 70,000 words to explain most topics. So what's your point? Make your point and move on. Be done with it out of respect for the reader. So I've always been very interested in storytelling because that's what people remember. That's what's interested. That's what's interesting. And B, how can I make this as short as possible? And short doesn't necessarily mean that like you're not going deep, that you're not covering the topic. There's a great quote, I think, from Mark Twain, where he said, when you're writing, leave out the parts that readers tend to skip, which is like that. Yes, that's what you should do. And everybody knows when you're reading a book that you get to a paragraph or even a whole chapter where you're like, I could skip this. I don't need to read this. Leave that part out and just like give you the meat and move on. So that's why I have stories that could live independently rather than rambling on one topic. And they're short chapters. I want to make my point and move on to the next.
So when I bring folks on the show to talk about their books, especially new books, I should have asked you this offline, but here we are online. Are there any questions that are off limits on the book? I want to make sure I don't spoil the book for readers. I want to make sure I respect that with you. All right.
No, let's go for it.
So you start off the book like with a really personal story about, ski, particularly about you and some friends skiing. I'd love to kind of like talk a little bit about that, because I feel like that kind of set the stage for the book itself. Do you mind like talking a little bit about that experience and how it set the stage for what this book really like represents?
Yeah. So the abbreviated story of this, of what I start with in the chapter is, as I said, I grew up ski racing in Lake Tahoe, and in 2001 we were 17 years old. Myself and two of my best friends, Brendan Allen and Brian Richmond, were skiing out of bounds at Squaw Valley, where you duck under the ropes that say "do not cross" and you ski out of bounds because that's where all the great skiing is. And when we get to the bottom, when you ski out of bounds, there's no chairlift at the bottom. You went out of bounds, so we would have to hitchhike back. We would ski until we hit a backcountry road, and then we'd hitchhike back. So the three of us did it that morning. And then when we got back to Squaw, after we hitchhiked back, Brendan and Brian said, "Hey, let's go do it again. Let's go ski that again." And I didn't want to. I didn't want to do it for whatever reason. I think probably the hitchhiking freaked me out. I didn't like that. So I said, "Hey, rather than doing it again, you guys go do it. And instead of hitchhiking, I'll drive my truck around and pick you up. And then like we're all set." We made our plan, went our separate ways. Brendan and Brian went skiing to do the run again. I went to pick them up. 20 minutes later, I go to pick them up and they're not there. And I didn't really think that much of it. Like, people were very comfortable being out of communication before cell phones that we had. So I really didn't bother me that much. But as the hours went on, people started realizing like something has happened. Nobody knows where Brendan and Brian are. More hours went on. We eventually got search and rescue involved. Search and rescue got on the mountain at about midnight, I think it was, during a horrendous blizzard. They had these giant floodlights. And when they entered the out of bounds area that I told them we were skiing in, they said it looked like half the mountain had been torn away from what was very clearly a fresh, enormous, massive avalanche that had just hit this area. So they began searching for this area. I'm sure they're putting two and two together at this point. After about 9 hours of searching, the search dogs kind of honed in on a spot in the avalanche field, and the rescuers found Brendan and Brian dead in the avalanche field, buried under about 6 feet of snow. And it took me years to piece this together. It was not really obvious. I mean, I was 17. I didn't think about much at the time, but if I had gone with them on that second run, 100% chance I'd be dead. I mean, the avalanches can be like tsunamis, just a ridiculous amount of force and power. Nobody can survive it. And then so when I look back, the decision to not go was a completely brainless, mindless, thoughtless decision. I did not weigh the pros and cons. I didn't do a risk analysis. It was just one of 1,000 other decisions I made that day. You guys go do it. I'm going to go do something else. And in hindsight, it's the most important decision that I ever made in my life by an order of magnitude. And I think everyone has some version of that story, whether you know it or not. Maybe it's like you left for work at 7:53 this morning, but if you left at 7:52, you would have been killed in a car accident or something like that. There's all these completely brainless decisions that can utterly change everything for good and bad. Like for a lot of people, how they met their spouse was like a dumb, brainless decision too. Some of these stories have very happy endings. But I think when you piece together how fragile the past is, you realize how fragile the future is going to be too. And then you don't fool yourself into thinking that you know what's going to happen in the next 5 years or the next 30 years in your own life or in the broader economy and society, because you don't. It's too fragile. When you piece together how fragile the past is, no one who is realistic about that would look at the next 5 years and say, I know where we're going. I know where I'm going or where the world is going. There's so many of these things that in hindsight were just dumb, brainless decisions that utterly changed the future.
So like Nassim Taleb talks about like black swans a lot, right? And it's really like we live in a world where it's like, oh, that's never going to happen. But yet we're living in a world where there's more and more black swans happening. There's the only like certainty is that there will be change or there will be unexpected items. We can use like COVID, for example, right? Like the world that shouldn't have happened, but yet there's like there's a pretty high chance that you're going to have a plague of some sort every 100 years. And lo and behold, we had one. Everyone's like, oh my God, I can't believe it's happening. Right. So what are your thoughts like around how do people think about that? Or how do you maybe think about that when it comes to like living life? Because I think that there's really two schools of thought that happen there. There's worrying about things that haven't happened and living through the pain of things that may never happen. And then the other part's just being like, fuck it. Like, I'm just going to go get after life and I'll deal with problems as they arise and I'll get good at dealing with problems. What's your approach or what's your thought process around that?
I think I probably fall somewhere in between where it's like, I mean, you mentioned Taleb. Another great quote from Taleb they use in the book is invest in preparedness and not prediction. Don't pretend that you can predict the next crisis, but prepare for whatever the next crisis might be financially, socially, psychologically, knowing that with 100% chance, something really bad is going to happen to you or the world or both in the next 5 years or probably the next year. And you don't know what it's going to be. It might be a recession, it might be another pandemic, it might be a terrorist attack. Nobody knows. But the world is fragile, and there's never any significant period of time in which the world does not break. I think historically, once a decade, the world breaks, where for virtually everyone, they wake up one day and they realize that the world they thought they lived in is very different. September 11th was obviously that. COVID was that. Pearl Harbor. There's all these events where it's like shaking events. It's usually about once per decade. And so in that world, yeah.
Well, let me jump in there because no, finish your thought and then I got a question on that. Sorry.
I just in that world, it pushes you more towards humility about what you can predict, but also just more room for error in your finances, in your careers, in your relationships, knowing that things are not very likely not going to be as stable as you want them to be. So have a giant room for error for these surprises that you can't even envision, knowing that they're going to be part of your future.
So I was using the 10-year rule, and I agree with you. I used to be a person that was like, must control outcome, I call it white knuckle, just white knuckling through trying to control outcomes. And I just turned 40 a couple years ago, and I was like, yeah, this is like kind of miserable, like trying to control every outcome. And there, it's a little bit about just surfing the wave, right? Like you're all right, like I'm just gonna get to your point. I'm not going to go out and not wear a wetsuit when it's 45-degree water. I'll wear a wetsuit. I'll prepare for a little bit of cold, right? Maybe I'll wear a little skull cap, but I'm also not going to over prepare and knowing that that's not going to solve the problem either. If I want to go surf, I'm going to surf. But when we look at things like GFC, for instance, right? You graduated college in 08. 07, I was actually running a subprime mortgage lender so so that was like my
You know.
former, yeah, right, totally. Like I literally like almost went bankrupt in like 90 days in that business. But what's funny was I said, well, Lehman Brothers got it wrong too. I wasn't, it wasn't like the number one mortgage lender in the United States got it wrong. I always joked I was in good company, right, when my business blew up. What when you think of a business like that, or like a moment like that, which is less, not 9/11. I remember when I was watching the screens, working at a finance job essentially at 6 a.m, watching planes fly into a building. That is about as black swan as you can get, right? Um, Whereas maybe GFC is less black swanish because you're like, well, they're making bad bets that people are kind of dogpiling into through derivatives and stuff like that. What do you consider like a more of a, do you ever think of things as like, that's a gray swan versus a black swan? Like, how do you think of those things?
I think in general, people get too tied up in the actual semantics of the word. I think just risks that you can't see coming is whether it was a black or a gray or a white swan. Taleb makes this point that COVID was not a black swan because, look, I mean, Bill Gates gave a TED talk in 2015 when he said the biggest societal risk we face is a viral pandemic. Now, he didn't know that it was going to be called COVID and it was going to hit in 2020. There's the details, but it was not impossible to see that was at least a likelihood, which I think you can't say for a lot of other things. I don't know if you could say that about 9/11, although even 9/11, like the World Trade Center was bombed by Al Qaeda operatives in 1993. So like,
Right.
I think for a lot of this, even if you know that something might be a risk and is at least a possibility, if not a likelihood, knowing the magnitude and knowing what you should do about it is a completely different thing. And knowing the timing of it is a completely different thing. And
Yeah.
that gets back to me about like, rather than assuming that you can predict the next crisis of when it's going to hit, like, oh, I think we're going to have a recession next year, so I'm going to change my investing strategy. That I think is largely BS for the huge majority of people. It's being prepared all the time for anything to happen, knowing that when it happens, you're not going to see it coming until the moment it's here. I think that's the bigger thing here.
Yeah, I totally agree. What do you, you tell a story in the book, which was one of my favorite stories in the book about like talking about like planning, right? Which is Harry Houdini and his death. I would love if you gave a little bit of tidbit on that, because that I literally, like, I was like, oh my God, A, I never knew it. And B, I thought it kind of speaks specifically to what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, so Houdini, of course, was like the world's foremost authority at surviving crazy risks. He could wrap himself in chains and put himself in a coffin and throw himself in a river and escape. And like, that'd be great. He also had this trick that he did in every show, which was at the end of the show, he would invite the largest man onto stage and he would tell that man to punch him in the stomach as hard as he could. Houdini was not a big guy, but he was a former amateur boxer. And his like claim to fame was he could flex his solar plexus in a way that could absorb any punch from anybody. So people that you get like a 6'5" guy to just wail on him and he wouldn't even budge. Like, people loved it. And so one day after one of these shows, he invites a group of college students back to meet him back in the dressing room. One of the students was a guy named Robert Whitehead, and Robert Whitehead walked up to Houdini unannounced and just started wailing on his stomach. Houdini was sitting on a couch and just started punching him in the stomach. He didn't mean any harm. He wasn't trying to beat the guy up. He thought he was just like recreating the trick that he just saw. But Houdini was not prepared for this. He wasn't flexing his stomach. And so he immediately like drops to the ground and he's overwhelmed in pain. And Whitehead like apologizes to him, like, I'm so sorry. I thought I was just doing the trick. And Houdini says, I was not prepared to be punched. Like, that's the whole trick, is that I'm prepared for it. I can flex. Houdini wakes up the next morning. He's completely doubled over in pain. His appendix had ruptured, or his spleen maybe had ruptured, almost certainly from the punch the night before. And he died later that day from this injury. So there's this irony of like, Houdini could survive any risk that he threw himself because he was prepared for it. But the one thing he's not prepared for, which is just like a skinny little kid's punch to the stomach, kills him. And so that is like, the biggest risk is what you don't see coming. It's not the biggest, it's not like the strongest thing that's going to hit you. It's not the biggest torment that's going to hit you. It's just what you're not prepared for that's going to do the most damage 10 times out of 10.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it kind of goes into this concept of certainty, right? People wanting to know what's going to happen. And you talk a lot in the book around that people don't want accuracy, they want certainty. Can you kind of like talk about that a little bit? Because I think this is actually a really good example of hey, like, he didn't see it coming, and it was the end. It was like, who would ever have thought that that's what would have killed this guy, right? And
Yeah.
but yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Like, what do you mean by that when you say that people don't want accuracy, they want certainty?
Look, if you want really good financial advice, you want someone who's going to come to you and say, for example, there's a 53% chance of a recession in the next year. I'm just making that number up, but someone who speaks in probabilities. But that's like, that should be what you want, but that's not what actually people want. Who they actually gravitate towards is a person on TV who says 100% chance of a recession, nothing you can do about it. It's going to destroy the economy. It's coming at us. If not, we're already there. That's who gets your attention. And the reason why is because what people actually want, they don't want to know what the future is going to be. They want to reduce the uncertainty that they have in their head. Uncertainty is really painful, and you want to get it out of your brain as soon as possible, not knowing what the future is going to bring. And the guy who says there's a 53% chance of recession does nothing to reduce the uncertainty in your brain. If anything, it accentuates it. You're like, the world is more uncertain now than it was before. But the person who says there is going to be a recession, even if he's full of shit, he just reduced the uncertainty in your head, and you feel better because of it. So that's who's gonna get your attention. And in the real world, how people judge forecasts is just black and white. Were you right or were you wrong? And a good example of this is Nate Silver, the statistician, who in 2016 during the presidential election, he said the day before the election, I think he said, I believe the numbers were, he said 80% chance Hillary Clinton wins, 20% chance that Trump wins. As we now know, Trump won. And a lot of people said Nate Silver was wrong. And Nate Silver's response was like, no, I gave him a 1 in 5 chance. Like, it was still a minority, but I gave him a 1. You would not play Russian roulette with a 1 in 5 chance because you know it might happen.
Right.
But people don't judge you like that. It's black or white. Like, did you say this was going to happen, and did it happen? And it's just like that. So someone who accurately, wisely speaks in probability is not what people want to hear. People want to hear certainty because that's what reduces the uncertainty that they have in their own head.
Yeah, I think it's like there's a bit of like, we're wired this way, like the negativity bias, right? Where people are like, hey, just tell me how bad it's going to be. I just want to know. And then, even though it may or may not happen, it is interesting to watch folks. Even I think the Nate Silver example is a perfect example, because to your point, like, there's no way Trump's going to win. You're like, I got a gun. There's 5 chambers. I'm putting 1 bullet in, and it's the exact same. And you wouldn't play that game, to your point. It's such a good example.
And people think it's a cop-out, because here's the thing. If Nate Silver said there is a 1% chance is going to win, that Trump is going to win, and then he went on to win, people like Nate Silver could still say that he was right. Like, he gave it a 1% chance, and that's what happened. It's just very difficult for people to gauge your accuracy when you are wisely speaking about probabilities rather than certainties.
Well, do you think it's because of like is this a human nature? Look, I'm like a probability guy. So for me, I'm like, yeah, what is 1 in 5? Like, there's a chance. There's a pretty good chance. Like, listen, if you told me that there's a 1 in 5 chance I'm going to be a trillionaire, I'd be pumped. I wouldn't act like that's zero, right? I would listen. I would play lotto every single day if that was the odds, right? As would anybody else. Do you think it's that most people just aren't good at odds? Like, what is it? What do you think it is around the human condition that creates these outcomes?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to think about multiple possibilities of what the future could be. It could be X, it could be Y, it could be Z. People don't want that. They want to just tell me what it's going to be. I use the other example in the book of the show. Jerry Seinfeld is driving around with Jimmy Fallon, and they're driving in a very old car, and the car doesn't have airbags. And Jimmy Fallon says, "Jerry, does it worry you that this car doesn't have airbags?" And Jerry says, "No. And be honest, how often in your life have you actually needed an airbag?" Which is like, it's supposed to be funny, because the answer is like, no, but you have an airbag for the very low probability that it's going to save your life, not because you need it every day. But I think that's a perfect example of how most people think. Like, they're not attuned to low probability risks in the slightest. And therefore, when these things occur, whether it's 9/11 or COVID or whatnot, they're utterly taken aback and knocked off their feet. And because their entire world is thinking about binary, yes or no, black and white, and only thinking about the high probability events that are going to occur, because it's easier and more comfortable to think that way. And it's always been like that, and I think it always will be.
Yeah, it's so interesting. There's a concept in the book you talk a lot about, which is best story wins. I'd love if you talked a little bit about that, explain what that is, and like where'd you come up with this, and how do you think people can apply that in trying to, I don't know, take over whatever they're trying to take over in the world?
Yeah, I think it's always the case in almost any field, any career, that the person who gets the most attention and the most success is not necessarily the person with the right answer or the best answer. It's the person who tells the best story. That's who gains people's attention, and you get them nodding along and they follow you, and you gain the biggest following, get the most success. It's just whoever tells the best story. Where did I start thinking about this? I think one of the things that came, so I'm in the book industry now, and one of the best-selling books of our time is Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari,
Yeah.
which a lot of people will don't have the best reviews of that book because, look, even by Harari's own admission, there's nothing new in there. He's writing about topics that people have known about for a long time, that other anthropologists covered way before he did. So a lot of readers and other anthropologists are like, there's nothing new in there. But the book sold like 30 million copies because it's really well written. It's a great story.
Totally.
And if you are the kind of person who is like shaking your fist, you're like, there's nothing new, it's not that good of a book, you're missing it. It's sold well because it's so well written. That's it. And here's what's crazy about it too. He wrote the book in Hebrew. The book, the version that we have was translated. It's just the best translation that's ever happened ever. And so but I think there are a lot of examples about that. I'm a huge Ken Burns fan, who makes documentaries.
Yeah.
Ken Burns is another example. His documentary on the Civil War came out in, I think, 1990 or 91. It was watched by more Americans that year than watched the Super Bowl.
Wow.
And what's crazy about it is that the Civil War is like the most documented event in U.S. history. Ken Burns did not release new information about what happened in the war. Everyone knows how it ends. Everyone knows what happened in between. What he did, better than anyone before or since, is told an amazing story. And Ken Burns has talked a lot about this. Some of what's so important about his documentaries is the background music. It's not even the pictures, what you're doing. It's the background music that puts you in the mood. And he told this amazing story one time. He said, in every documentary he's made, he will adjust the script so that the narrator says a specific word at the moment a specific beat in the background music hits. And I was just like, no other historian is doing that. And that's why Ken Burns can be watched by damn near every American, while some other history professor at some other university is getting nobody's attention. It's just Ken Burns is a way better storyteller than them.
So in like thinking of like the theme of the book is really the lesson there that if you want people to follow, like this is really that we as humans, we follow the stories, right? That we are attracted to the stories, that this is how, I mean, obviously before there's written history, this is how history came about, was through storytelling. Is that really the lesson that you're kind of trying to impart?
Yeah, I think there's two things. So like, one, that's how other people gain attention. So if you are the kind of person who thinks the best answer wins, you're going to be really frustrated with how the world works, because it's not. The person who tells the best story wins. Now, sometimes the person who tells the best story also has the best answer. Steve Jobs was probably in that, like made the best technology and marketed better than anybody else. Totally. So sometimes those people have both. But there's also a lot of areas in life, particularly like politics, where the person who's getting ahead sometimes has some of the worst answers about what to do, but they're very persuasive and they say exactly what people want to hear. Same thing happens in finance. The people who go on TV and tell you how to invest your money are sometimes giving the worst advice that you can possibly imagine, but they're very persuasive when they give that terrible advice. Yeah. And so that's a lot of it. The other area is, if you're an entrepreneur or whatnot, if you think that you need to reinvent the wheel to come up with a new idea, you don't. There's so much low-hanging fruit of taking what is already there, what's already existing, and telling a better story around it. Like, you don't need to invent something brand new. You can just take something that already exists and do a better job appealing to people's emotions for there to be so much opportunity right there in front of you.
I love that, man. It's so true. It's so true in business. I mean, you look at like there's so many examples of that. I mean, I could go down the list. I mean, Chick-fil-A, In-N-Out Burger, Costco. There's nothing new with any of those three businesses, and they crush. Every one of them crushes because the story that they built around their brand is interesting, right? Virgin,
I think
all this.
I think there's a lot of this, like when Steve Jobs came out with the iPhone, Nokia and Motorola and Microsoft were building better phones. At the time, they were better phones. The iPhone was just had a story behind it. And Steve Jobs was so good at convincing you that this was cool and this was a better product, that even if there were some certain features that Nokia was making that were actually superior to the iPhone was the cool one. That was a story that people wanted to attach to.
Totally. Yeah. I just saw the BlackBerry movie, and you're like, you forget that BlackBerry had 45% of the market.
Yeah.
If like almost one out of every two people had a BlackBerry. I had a BlackBerry before. I mean, I didn't love it. I had one. I liked it was too big, but yeah, that's such a good example, and I think those all support this idea that best story wins, and some to the detriment of some are negative, right? Depending on your viewpoints, especially in politics, right?
Yeah.
You see this happen all the time, whether it's a position or whether it's a candidate. So I totally agree with that.
To that, I'll tell a quick story about this. One that's always just is one of those stories that I read that just knocked you on your ass and you start piecing together how the world works. There's a really good book called What We Knew, which is a book that interviews German civilians in the 1940s. And the book just says, what did you know about the Holocaust, about the war? These are just German civilians in town. And one of the women, just a German civilian in the 40s, she starts going into detail about why the Germans supported Hitler. And she says, you have to remember, in the 1920s, the German economy fell apart. Hyperinflation, we lost everything. Hitler came around and said, I have a better idea. I'm going to give you prosperity. I'm going to give you dignity. It was such an appealing message to the people who had no hope that at least a meaningful amount of Germans said, sign me up. I'm there for it. He just told a way better story. And he told the story that a lot of Germans wanted to hear at the time. This person, so that story I do tell in Same as Ever. And that person went on to say, like, look, it obviously completely spun utterly out of control. But at the time, she said, if you are in a desperate spot and somebody comes along and tells you that they have a better way, you are not going to say no to that person.
Yeah, it's so interesting. If you if you overlap Sapiens, right? In that book, he talks about how the cost of war, as opposed to the riches and spoils it brought, were so in favor of going and doing war that if you're Hitler, you're like, all right, I'm going to build national pride, because to your point, there was so like the national pride in Germany after World War One was decimated, right? They got crushed, and they had to give up tons of power and money and all whatnot. And then you're like, okay, let's just look at this from again. Everyone knows how this story ends. It's a terrible situation, terrible. Everything about him coming to power was terrible. But to your point, like, yeah, like if I'm in his shoes, I'm like, hey, I know how I can totally revive this economy. I'm just going to go take over tons of countries and take that momentum and roll it, because back then the cost of war, as opposed to the productivity and outcome I got from it, was in favor of me committing war than compared to today, right? So super interesting.
I think one of the takeaways is like, there's so many historical examples of economic collapse kind of leading to social collapse, because when there's economic collapse, people become very susceptible to any kind of narrative from anyone who steps up and says, I have a better way forward.
Totally. Yeah. Because what do they have to lose, right? They're like, hey, my life sucks right now anyway. Like,
exactly.
What do I have to lose?
Exactly.
I know we're running a little short on time here, but I wanted to touch on one last part of the book, and then we always do the greatness question. I forgot to give you the preface before the show that we do the greatness question, so we'll end on that. But you talk about a concept of calm plants the seed for crazy in the book. Tell us a little bit about that, because I thought that really stood out to me.
It's just this idea that what creates volatility in the economy and a lot of areas in the world is the stability that preceded it. So think about the economy. If the economy is strong and people are optimistic, very naturally, they will go into debt, because that's the normal thing you do when you're optimistic about your future. You lever up. Now, when they go into debt, the economy becomes unstable. And when the economy is unstable, you're eventually going to have a recession. So you piece all that together, and it was the stability, it was the lack of recessions that caused the next recession. Calm plants the seeds of crazy. It's the same in the stock market. If people think the stock market never goes down, they very rationally put more money into it. They invest more money. That makes valuations go up. And when valuations go up, you're eventually going to have a crash. It's like one leads to the other. The same is true in reverse. Like when the economy collapses, then the seeds of its revival are already planted, because you have panicked-induced innovation for companies trying to survive by coming up with something new. You have lower valuations, opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So just understanding the normal cyclicality of these things is really important, because whenever there is a recession or a bear market, it's normal and natural to say the economy broke and I need to find who broke it and punish them. But
Right.
I think when you take a step back, you're like, no, this is an unavoidable part. If I hope to be participating in this economy for the next 50 years, I know unavoidable, 100% chance there are going to be a dozen more recessions, bear markets, screw ups, etc. It's completely unavoidable. So I think understanding the cyclicality of why these things happens just makes dealing with them a little bit more palatable.
I think that concept comes full circle, right? In that you're not gonna be able to plan that. When I hear people say that there's gonna be an economy, to your point earlier, I'm like, this person has no fucking idea what they're talking about. Yes, maybe there's some economic indicators that suggest that, but you never know. We never have the same recession twice. But to your point, in the earliest part of this conversation is all we can control is being prepared for prepared as best as we possibly can for that. And I think that's I think I really love that concept because I think it's I at least got some comfort where I'm like, you know, I can only control what I can, and I can't control the world around me. I can't control, what's happening right now in the Middle East. I can't control who's going to win the next election. I can't control, what's going to happen in the economy. But I can control as best as I possibly can to be prepared. So I thought that was a really, really great concept in the book, and I love the calm plants a seed of crazy. And when you think about let's just even talk about the last run up. You had GFC happens, you got a sharing economy that comes out of it. You have a massive innovation with like Uber and Airbnb. You have like Bitcoin came out of that time frame, right? And now we're in you have this huge bull run that came out of that, and here we are right now with COVID, and we're post COVID, and we're in this kind of this squishy in between time. So I do think that there's what does Buffett say? He says, like about a good crisis, right? Don't let a good crisis go to waste, right? It's kind of to your point that breaking that breaking in the system, that breaking in the economy, that creates some inefficiencies that people can go and then fill. So I love that idea.
Thank you. Now, of course, you always want to make sure that you are one of the survivors of that breakage. You don't want to be the person who's going bankrupt yourself. You want to be able to endure that carnage, and those are the people who are going to come out stronger from it.
Yeah, you got to stay in the game. I always say that, man. You got to stay in the game. So, oh man, Morgan, I could have you here for another hour. This was just like we didn't even talk about the Psychology of Money, which is an amazing book in of itself. But the new book's super cool, and I'm really pumped for all the success that you have and are going to continue to have. So why don't we do this? Let's do the greatness question, and then we'll tell folks where they can get the book. Does that work for you?
Let's do it. I'm ready.
All right. So here at the Greatness Machine, we are all about creating greatness in the world. So our greatness question is this, and I'll give you a second to think about it. What is the number one barrier to creating greatness that you've overcome in your life, and how did you overcome it?
Oh, I think I don't need a second to think about it. I think I would say understanding that there is a difference between what society tells you should want and what you actually want for yourself deep down is really important, because what I want out of my life, Darius, might be different from what you want. Not because we disagree or we're smarter than one another, just everybody's different. And so by and large, society tells everybody that they should want the same thing. And I think the majority of people don't actually want that thing. That thing being, I want to be rich and prestigious and famous and a big house and a nice car. Everyone's different. So for me, a lot of things in life clarified. And I think I became happier when I said, look, this thing that I'm supposed to want, I don't actually want it. What I want is this thing over here, which is independence and autonomy and spending time with my friends and family. That's what I actually want. And so once I just said, I don't want to play that game anymore. I want to play my own game, and I'm going to get really good at my game. And I love my game. That to me was the barrier that was overcome that added a lot of fulfillment to my life.
I love that, man. I can't remember who said it. They said everyone should become rich and famous once in their life to realize that they don't want it. So
Jim Carrey.
That's right. Yeah. I heard that. It just made me think of that. Man, Morgan, what a badass. I love you, man. I love the book. I love everything you're saying. Everyone needs to go out there and support all the things you're working on, including your podcast, the Morgan Housel podcast. So we're going to put all that stuff in the show notes. But the book is Same as Ever, A Guide to What Never Changes. And also go get The Psychology of Money. I love that book as well. Where can folks get the books? Where can they connect with you? Where can they learn more about all things Morgan?
You know where they buy books: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Border. Whatever the one is at the airports. Wherever books are sold, I guess you should say. I also spend a lot of my time on Twitter. My handle is my first and last name, Morgan Housel.
Awesome. So we'll make sure we put that. I think you almost busted a Borders books.
I almost said Borders. The one at the airport. I forget what it was called. The airport bookstore. Borders. Yeah. God bless them. We certainly miss you, Borders.
Yeah. We big shout out to Borders. Morgan, man, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate you here at the Greatness Machine, man, and wish you the best of luck.
Thanks so much, Darius.
All right. Everybody, go get the book. Go support Morgan. Sign up. We're going to put all this stuff in the show notes. Until next time, peace out. We love you. She's my lover. You are listening to The Greatness Machine, and that's a wrap for today. Listen, if you love what you heard, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform that you're tuning in on so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. We have tons of great people coming on, and we're stoked to have you here to enjoy it with us. Leave us a review. Tell us what you love most about this particular episode. We love getting the reviews. We love to see what you guys love most. And if this particular episode, made you think of someone who's leveling up in their business and in their life, print screen, share it with them. Leaders are the best givers. And after all, we're all here to support and grow with each other. And in case you want to see some of the fun behind the scenes shots or some of the things that we're doing, I'm actually writing about this in my weekly newsletter. Go to www.therealdarius.com and subscribe to my newsletter. We're talking about fun things like business and life and mindfulness and cryptocurrencies and gosh, I don't even know, everything and anything, but it's tons of fun stuff I write about. I try to get it out on a weekly basis. You can subscribe at www.therealdarius.com. And with that said, look, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. I love you. Peace. We're out of here. See you guys on the next one. She's my lover.